Ready to explore the cutting edge of digital infrastructure? I'm Carrie Charles, your host of Let's Get Digital. Join me as we dive into the ideas, technologies, and leaders transforming the way we connect. From wireless telecom to fiber networks, data centers, and beyond. Sponsored by Broadstaff in partnership with RCR Wireless News. Now, let's dive in and let's get digital.
Thanks for joining me on Let's Get Digital. I'm Carrie Charles, your host, and today I have with me Phil Shih. He is the founder and managing director of Structure Research. Phil, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So we met at ITW, right?
Yep, that wasn't that long ago.
Yeah, it sure wasn't. Boy, time flies. I know you have, an interesting journey, and I'd love to hear a little bit about the founding story of Structure Research, how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, I mean, the whole story, it's just so much kind of living life and then just kind of making decisions based on, opportunities and doors that open and kind of getting to the point in life where you thought, hey, maybe there's a better way to do this. And kind of saying, hey, I got to take the leap. If I'm ever going to do it, I got to do it now. It was kind of like that kind of thinking, and like you, I think many years ago, you just said, hey, what would it be like to not have a boss and to drive a lot of the decisions that I increasingly am not agreeing with in the firm I'm at? I don't think that's an unusual, that's not a unique story, but honestly, that's what drove it. It's like that question. It's like, hey, what if I did, have the control and the ability to make decisions and drive this in the way I want. But that's going to take a leap, as in, saying goodbye to a regular paycheck, the predictability and the comfort, and trying something completely different, which, I think a lot of entrepreneurs or people who've gone on their own did not necessarily have that in the plans, have that in store. Again, it's about opportunity. And, the field I was in, or the field that we are in, this industry, was healthy then. I think I saw the upside as many of us did. And I thought, well, if you put those things together, wow, maybe this could work. And yeah, I'm glad I made the leap. It was something that I didn't expect, but I'm glad it's working out. And I'm grateful for the opportunity that the industry has provided.
How many years ago was that?
Yeah, 2011. So late in 2011, I decided to make the jump, and I've been at it ever since.
Okay, well, you know what you're doing. So let's get into it. Well, first, tell us more about Structure Research.
Yeah, in a nutshell, for those of you who aren't familiar, we describe ourselves and think of ourselves as a boutique research firm, which is another way of saying we're smaller, we're slightly understaffed, but we are specialists. And that's kind of part and parcel of our value proposition. We have 7 analysts that spend all our time in this sector. When I say this sector, we used to call it internet infrastructure, but data centers, managed cloud, managed hosting, what used to be called managed hosting. But the infrastructure services ecosystem, what fits now under the kind of broader rubric of digital infrastructure, we're kind of more focused on the compute-oriented infrastructure side rather than, say, wireless and connectivity. We're very much, I started my career basically, following server hosting companies. And that's morphed over the years into managed services, data centers, and now hyperscale and AI. So yeah, the boutique, that's who we are. We spend all our time publishing industry-focused research. Think of us as living in the kind of middle ground between a Wall Street analyst or a street analyst that's focused on earnings, the stock, the value of that stock and recommending it to investor clients. And then on the other side of the spectrum, kind of more technical or technology-oriented analysts that are focused on the kind of details and the nuts and bolts of the technology pieces. We're very much focused on the industry, kind of macro trends, the landscape, the big picture, helping, ultimately trying to provide information, perspective, and insights to help executives make decisions. And that's kind of, in a nutshell, who we are.
So you do compete in a space with massive analyst firms. And I guess I would look at it a little bit like David and Goliath, but what makes your boutique approach different and also advantageous for your clients?
Yeah, I mean, it's, again, the specialization kind of creates a certain amount of efficiency for the executive decision maker that subscribes to the service. They want information that's tailored and curated to their world, their focus, and what they care about. That's our pitch when we meet people. It's like, hey, if you're spending a lot of time in this sector, if you care about what's going on in this sector, if you have a stake whether financial or kind of strategic, we could be the right service for you. We don't kind of try to cover too much ground. And that's how, honestly, too much ground in the sense that we don't cover a lot of other sectors. We're not even covering broader digital infrastructure like towers, as I mentioned. Wireless and connectivity is kind of slightly kind of peripheral to what we do. And that's how we exist. You asked the question, how do we exist against some of the larger firms? Well, we've selected a sector that we think is valuable, that is frankly a bit undercovered. Don't let that get out. And say, hey, we're all about this. And if this is what you care about, we could be of service. We're not for everybody, and we're pretty comfortable with that. And again, that's our pitch, and that's how we survive. The bigger firms tend to offer more and continue to offer more. They're obviously have hundreds, thousands of people on their staff, and they can cover a lot of ground. But we give you something very focused. So we dive into we're able to provide a lot of depth, and we give you a senior analyst perspective, everybody in our team. Whether you're a junior analyst, but you quickly, within our kind of environment, ramp up pretty quickly because you're just doing this. You're not focused on anything else.
Okay, that makes sense. And you've been doing it a long time.
Yeah, since 2011, and, kind of just gradually built up the team over the years. And yeah, that's the great world of remote working. We were a remote team before COVID, the pandemic.
Yeah.
So,
and it's working. That's great. That's great. So you have an event. I guess it's been going for 6 years now, right? It's infrastructure. Infra is, I guess, it's small letters. And then there's, structure is all caps, but it's an infrastructure summit. It's in Las Vegas, October 15th and 16th. I know I'm going to be there. Can you tell us a little bit about the event? What makes it different than all the other industry events as well?
So infrastructure was founded, we had our first event in 2018. It is the sixth edition this year. There were a couple years where we didn't have it due to that pandemic. And it started as, and still is, meant to be an executive summit that is unique in the sense in that it's very uncommercialized. So the content is obviously the agenda is backed, supported, and led by an analyst team that is independent, that is not tied to, kind of any vendor or platform or investment vehicle. Rather, we bring those parts of the ecosystem to our summit so that people can kind of network, partner, engage in business development, and of course, discuss kind of the present and future of the sector. And so research, I believe, and I think our audience, values, is a really great backdrop and context for that discussion. And so that's what we decided to do in 2018. We slowly built up the event. And, our mantra for the summit is, quality over quantity. So we're not trying to build an expo. We actually don't really have an exhibit hall. We make this very clear to our sponsors that want to come, that if you want to come, it's a different type of engagement. There's obviously room for business development, but the way you go about it, the way you engage is a bit different because it's a summit, because we're in the participation is in the hundreds rather than thousands. Yeah.
No, give me a little bit of a peek into the agenda, maybe some topics that you're going to cover and people who are going to attend, maybe.
Yeah, so it's it's executive heavy. So VPC level, a lot of owners, a lot of entrepreneurs who run their business, a lot of CEOs, and that's kind of the primary demographic. But we surround them with two other major kind of groups of people, which are investors and financiers, or people on the finance side of the real estate side of the game, and then suppliers, people who sell products, services, or resources to the operating service providers so that they can build and deliver their services. Real estate can also fall in that category. Increasingly, we have energy, and then, of course, software and hardware and construction services and commissioning services, various types of vendors that support this ecosystem. So that's the audience. And then the agenda tries to cater to the questions of the day that, everybody, again, that has a stake and interest in the sector, want answers to or want to hear discussion about or hear from, leading minds and, thought leaders in the space. So, you asked about the agenda this year. We try to find a balance. So there's going to be some sessions, M&A, on the strategic landscape, big picture questions around, the impact of AI, the impact of the recent hyperscale pullbacks, how that impacts the demand profile of the sector. We have various topics on energy this year. How are energy constraints influencing or constraining the ability of operating companies to continue to build in the face of significant steam of demand? And of course, there's always not doom, I shouldn't say doomsday. There are always those who are a little skeptical, and it's a great balance. This year we hope to have a lot of discussion between those who are a bit bearish and those who are a bit bullish. That seems to come up every kind of cycle or phase in the sector where you see some skeptics rise up, and, not without, kind of legitimate concerns about where things are going. But that fuels a great debate and discussion, and we love the diversity of opinions and takes.
So, your 2025 theme is concurrence.
Mhm.
And I wanted you to talk more about what that means and why is it the right framing for today's infrastructure challenges?
Yeah, every year we try to pick one word as the theme, right? So we've had, except for the first year, but we've had decentralization to kind of capture where the sector was moving a bit to the edge, acceleration coming out of the pandemic and in terms of kind of where the growth was. And this year we picked concurrence, which is meant to capture kind of just the many moving parts in the space, right? So I did have to look up the dictionary definition of concurrence, and it is on the website. I kind of cut that out and put it in there. Thanks, Merriam-Webster. But, just try to capture kind of where the sector is in terms of how it's preparing and engaging in building for this, next wave that's coming. And so a lot of moving parts, a lot of different things happening at the same time. That's kind of what we're trying to capture. Hyperscale cloud is still driving things. AI is on the horizon. Power constraints are developing. That opens up kind of a different regulatory picture. Capital is flowing into the sector. How do all these things moving kind of at the same time and kind of changing the way things are done? How do we make sense of that? How does the sector organize around that to push forward? So hopefully that makes sense. We do try to be a little edgy and different, but at the same time capture what is kind of the most kind of pressing kind of dynamics in this space, and hopefully that's what the concurrence is about.
So, with over 20 years covering global
Mhm.
infrastructure services, what have been the most impactful market shifts that you've observed?
Yeah, I mean, I think quite clearly the biggest shift was, and probably let's just agree, the sector was born in the late 90s, early 2000s. So the big shifts, I think, have been pretty clear. That, for those of you who are a little older and remember the dot-com bubble, seems like, it's almost 25 years ago now, quarter century. That would be kind of the first thing, one of the first big seismic events that kind of gave birth in many ways to the sector, as a lot of, operating companies kind of built out of the dregs of what happened. And the sector was so young, a lot of assets were sold pennies on the dollar, and the value proposition of the space kind of took advantage of that situation to kind of build. And then in 2000, the next kind of big development, 2006, AWS, Amazon decides to get into the cloud business. Back then, strictly, known as an online book retailer, really not even, what did you buy from Amazon in 2006 besides books? Nothing. They got into the cloud business, which was a curiosity at the time, but, set off a decade plus move from kind of traditional infrastructure, which was still young and still developing. We didn't call it cloud then, but was still developing. And then, at the same time, this kind of hyperscaled, what we now call hyperscale cloud, public cloud, was developing in the background, started to increasingly kind of become more prominent, and now arguably, is probably the dominant kind of computing platform of choice for, not to say it's the only one, but is definitely, front and center and controls a significant part of this ecosystem. And so our sector has transitioned and built around that. Data centers, managed services, MSPs are all part of that. And of course, there's still a lot of diversity in terms of other cloud platforms, but that's the big one. That's been, depending on what part of the world you're sitting in, a decade and a half. It's always amazes me how young some parts of the world, they're hyperscale. The markets, in those countries are so young, maybe just a few years with hyperscale cloud. So that wave's still ongoing. And I think the next big one, most of us can agree, is coming. How it's going to play out, we don't all agree on, but, AI and how that kind of is going to accelerate things is the next big kind of inflection point wave that will pick up. But interestingly, I think overlap a bit with hyperscale cloud.
So, you've led consulting mandates
Mhm.
totaling over 3 billion in deals. Am I right? My reading, my research?
I think so. Yeah. If we put it out there, we did a bit of
Okay,
quick
good.
math. Yeah.
Okay, good. Can you share a standout transaction that really shaped Structure Research's strategic approach?
Sure. So, we're not a consulting firm. We're a research firm at heart. That's the kind of the majority of, our business model is built on that. We do consulting on a strategic basis, on a selective basis, mostly around, as you mentioned, M&A transactions. We don't necessarily lead that process. We let the consultants do what they're good at. We come in as the market expert, the subject matter expert, market data source and support transaction activity in that way. So, we've done small transactions, large scale ones. We've done the first one I did under the banner of structural research was actually in Europe, but we've done work in North America and we have quite a specialized practice in Asia Pacific. Our head of research and myself hail from the region, still have strong ties there, spend a lot of time there. And that's actually where the largest transaction we've done, which was the kind of previous, not the recent one, but the previous investment in Australia's air trunk, which is, hyperscale data center platform. And, that value is a good chunk of the 3 billion you referenced. But yeah, I mean, that's just one example of things we've done in the past to support M&A in the space.
Do you have proprietary data sets that differentiate your insights?
Absolutely. All our market share data, everything we put out there is built from the ground up internally and organically. It's a pretty painful, painstaking, process. It's a grind, we describe it, but, we feel it pays off and it ensures the, integrity of the data that we put out there. So yeah, every data set is based on, what we feel is, hard work, we like to call it getting boots on the ground, talking to operators, visiting sites, making sure we're double checking those facts with other sources. A lot of what we call triangulation, throwing out the high, throwing out the low, taking data points, try to compare them. And, you tend to get closer to the truth if you undertake that process. So yeah, absolutely. Everything we put out there, we've built, we own, we stand by it and try to refine. I think one of the other things that I think we do really well is that we refine over time. So we're always kind of, we don't think we have the answers at any given time. And, if we see other kind of facts or feedback or insights that tell us that we're wrong, we're going to adjust. And so that, over time, we get closer to the truth. And that's the approach we've taken.
So data center M&A hit record levels in 2024. I was reading that also. And what do you think is driving this? I mean, we probably all know that, but what should infrastructure leaders know about navigating this current M&A environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting, I mean, I would say not that I have a hard data point, but my sense definitely is that the number of transactions is lower, but the value is higher, right? That's kind of if you were measuring like, hey, there was more about, more transactions. It's because the numbers are just so big now. What would I say in terms of, kind of where we are and where we're going and how would operating executives kind of look at that? I would say, I mean, first of all, I think that's one thing that hasn't changed is that the sector has always seen consistent and steady strategic activity across the board from kind of early gen cloud, smaller service providers to the largest, operating platforms in the world. I think it's a product of the fact that the sector has always been, very kind of fragmented in its own way across different segments and now is increasingly global, which is actually not caused, but, led to kind of you could argue more fragmentation with regional markets, and global operating companies operating in different regions and countries around the world. So I think that's just kind of part and parcel of how this stuff is built, is that because infrastructure is not like an iPhone or something, it's not like a closed walled garden, it's really aggregation and piecing together of different resources. And they're done in different ways in different markets in different countries and regions around the world. And so that creates a very heterogeneous environment that's conducive to M&A. So I don't think it's going away. It goes through waves where there's more activity than not. But, in my experience, it's been steady just for so long. And I know a lot of my kind of M&A and banking contacts are very happy about that, of course. But yeah, I would say to operating executives that it's always something there to support, strategic activity can always support growth and expansion. There are great options out there. The value of, the valuation of assets in the space has always been high. It continues to, to climb depending on what part of the market you're in. And that would be, I guess, the last kind of, I guess if I could add a tidbit is to understand which segment you're in the market and to kind of build, evolve, and transition your business accordingly. right? So there are always going to be certain segments within the overall kind of data center infrastructures, cloud infrastructure space that are trending in a better direction, that have, healthier upside. There's some services now that we call legacy fairly because they, are at a different stage in their evolution. And so when you're looking at operating assets, whether you're, or an operating side and looking to exit, or you're on the buying side and looking to build, expand, diversify, augment, I think that is the most important to think about. And hopefully a research firm can help provide some context to that.
So we can't have a conversation without talking about AI. So here we go.
Mhm.
And everyone's talking about AI driving massive data center demand,
Mhm.
but you track the actual numbers.
Mhm.
So, behind the hype, if you will. So what does that real data tell us about AI's impact on the sector?
Yeah, it's a crazy time to be an analyst because the short answer to that question is, the materialization of that demand is still very much at a very early stage of development, right? So that's not to say that things haven't landed and are running and impacting growth. It certainly has. But the kind of surge or the wave that we expect if this technology continues to move in the direction we see it moving, we're still probably a few years out, right? To see that kind of really spike or shift in that trajectory, on your PowerPoint charts and everything. Maybe it will look like a hockey stick, but not right now. Right now, things are still being driven by what they've been driven by, which is public cloud, hyperscale cloud. But you're starting to see kind of these models start to be built. And then when that happens, there's kind of a spin-off effect into across infrastructure, right? So the models will be trained, and they'll have to be used by the end user to deliver them. They'll have to, build inferencing infrastructure. And then to maintain, fine tune, and perfect those models, you're going to need infrastructure, kind of that sits almost in between where the models are built, the large scale models, and then of course the inferencing. And so that's more infrastructure. And then you need connectivity to move the data, to access the data, which means more interconnection uptake, more network services. And that spins off into service providers, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, it's, the way we're modeling it is, we're trying, it's not an exact science as you can imagine, but we're trying to kind of predict when in the next few years some of these things start to come online and that spin-off effect takes shape and then impacts kind of the entire ecosystem. So our latest update, our latest numbers, you'll see a meaningful increase in what we're projecting for growth, but with a spike not quite coming just yet. And it's very hard to predict and understand what that spike will look like. So historical precedent is useful, but not always a perfect kind of comparison.
Can you just give me a little peek into what you're predicting?
Yeah. No. I mean, I think we had the data center colocation space last year growing at about 13.5% globally. We now have it closer to 20% and believe it'll be growing over 20% in the next few years based on kind of everything we're seeing.
So are we building fast enough? And what are the bottlenecks that most people are just not seeing?
Yeah, it's difficult to say if we're building or not building fast enough because the state of this, the way this demand will kind of materialize is hard to predict. We don't really, because it's so new. Hyperscale cloud, if you're building availability zones for traditional cloud infrastructure, we have enough of a sample size to kind of be able to predict within reason what it might look like. These things are going to look very different. So it's hard. I say it's hard to say, and I think I kind of just missed the other part of your question as I was saying that.
The bottlenecks.
Well, right. The bottlenecks. So yeah, so it's difficult to say whether we're building too fast just because we don't know we don't have a clear picture yet of what's coming. But in terms of bottlenecks, absolutely, I think you can see that, the most clear kind of characteristic of this next wave is the amount of energy that needs to be consumed. And there are increasingly signs that in the most mature markets, especially, of course, in the United States, that if any of these predictions, or projections are even close, there's going to be significant kind of shortage of energy. And so that's kind of one of the biggest, if not the biggest constraint. I would throw in there as well, which related to energy is, of course, land and, real estate. But there's also, a shortage of expertise, right? So you need, hyperscale platforms have come to build on their own. They face their self-build internally and not use data center colocation operators. They've come across their own constraints, and there are only so many, credible, reputable, established kind of data center operating platforms that can build at this level, at this scale, at the quality that's going to be required. So yeah, land, energy, expertise, and then the regulatory environment as well could be a constraint given, the constraints on energy are going to cause a shift to alternative sources of energy. Nuclear being that one that's been discussed quite a bit, but also comes with a lot of regulatory implications. So yeah, it's concurrence, a lot of like a lot of things happening at the same time that need to be resolved and solved for before the sector can move forward.
So I'm a data center, let's say I'm a data center owner operator. What are some key data points that I need to know that will help me navigate all of this, the concurrence?
Yeah, I would say come to the show and, and hear the discussion. That's one. Las Vegas in October is not a bad time of year. But, it's a good question. There's so many different kind of data points and factoids. I would say, if you're an operating executive, is to kind of look for, honestly, I mean, the market is healthy, but at the same time, there's a lot of competition, right? There's a lot of capital flowing to space. Everybody wants to get involved. Finding a market inefficiency is whether you're a new operating platform or an existing one that's looking for other opportunities, finding where market inefficiencies are, I think is going to be increasingly important. Sometimes the industry kind of, I don't want to say, maybe over indexes a bit, or there's a lot of opportunity. And so everyone flocks in one direction and then certain parts get neglected, right?
Yes.
Obviously people push, a certain direction because for good reason, but in that process, certain things come up, have certain areas get slightly neglected. And so I think you're going to start to see investors, operating companies should explore kind of what we've described as the edge hyperscale market, which is kind of something that exists between enterprise and kind of large scale hyperscale that everybody has been chasing, availability zones, regions that, is a bit underserved, but there's, no shortage of demand that's starting to build towards that. So, edge hyperscale, pretty broad term meant to capture kind of second tier markets, or even within, major markets, but certain type of requirement that's, broadly speaking, single digit megawatt to, 10 or 20 versus the very large deployments. And of course, the smaller kind of enterprise, which is kind of a different, increasingly a different business in and of itself.
Let's keep looking at your crystal ball. What are
Mhm.
hyperscalers going to do next?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the one thing to keep in mind is that the CapEx investments, the amount of investments they're making in data center and server infrastructure has not slowed down. Google yesterday confirmed a increase in their projection by $10 billion for their 2025 CapEx. So it went to 75 to 85. I'm sure some of you have already seen that. So the hyperscaler is going to continue expanding. They're not, they're going to, I think, behave as they always have, which is, from the data center operating perspective, a little fickle, a little kind of back and forth, a little, they're stressed, as many of us. They're trying to build for the future and trying to project, and they kind of oscillate between going their own and then working with their partners. Sometimes they will kind of go through kind of phases where they emphasize one strategy over the other. It's an imperfect science. They're going to miss. They're going to have difficulties, and engagement with partners, I think, will always be a part of the strategy. The way these partnerships kind of move forward, or the service that's provided them from an infrastructure perspective, can change and is changing. That would be my feedback to operating executives is trying to understand what the hyperscalers are doing, is that know that they have difficulty with this and will. This is not easy. Know that there are, they are, you could argue, a bit understaffed when it comes to hyperscale procurement. The teams that people are working with are not big. So, understand that they have a need for knowledge. They're going to continue to need to collaborate and partner, share information. And so I do predict a ongoing collaborative relationship, even if it can be a little bumpy, maybe even a little weird at times, or, frustrating and stressful. But I think kind of if you take a step back and look at the big picture, it is still going to, and I think need to be collaborative and a relationship between partners rather than, a vendor selling something to a buyer or an end user.
Where else could hyperscale demand come from?
I still think we're in the phase of, we're in this long kind of Maybe it's going to be a 2 decade build out around the world. I mean, a lot of hyperscale demand is coming from emerging markets in the world. Our practice is a bit slanted to, three major regions, North America, Western Europe, and Asia Pacific, not including China. And, we spend time in a lot of the second tier markets in those regions, especially Europe and Asia. And I can tell you that they are just getting started with some of this stuff. So the amount of hyperscale demand coming out of those regions, and if you look at South America, Middle East, Africa, we don't spend as much time. They're just getting started as well. So I think the global kind of build out of cloud is still very much in its first phase and in the kind of second and third tier. That may not be an opportunity for everybody, granted, but that is a significant driver of growth in the future. And of course, AI in the sense that, the tools and services that are driving cloud consumption. And I think sometimes this gets overlooked is that AI is fueling kind of quote, quote, traditional or public cloud infrastructure growth in that people are running compute and storage on the cloud, but increasingly buying AI or AI type services that are built and delivered through the cloud as a delivery vehicle. And so that's why we're seeing public cloud growth, and this quarter's earnings season is already showing it, steady, if not acceleration in growth, just driven by the uptake in those services.
So, Phil, you've seen multiple technology cycles. What's your prediction for the next major inflection point in digital infrastructure?
I would say my prediction is that it's going to be a very long kind of wave, right? I think the hyperscale build out is still going on, and it's like I said, it's been going on for a decade, decade and a half. AI, I think, is going to take that to the next level. So we'll probably think of it as a second wave, but really it's just adding fuel to the fire. I think it's an accelerant of what's going on now. Again, strictly from an infrastructure perspective. And so, yeah, I think it's going to start in a few years, and we could be talking about another decade or two of, significant infrastructure growth. And data centers and digital infrastructure, internet infrastructure, whatever term you want to throw on it, increasingly becoming just one of the just kind of major industries, that we think about, right? Healthcare, financial services, something that's just kind of core to everybody's life. And if you just kind of look, I think I'll leave you with this. If you kind of look at what's happening in the US, in the Midwest, right, where a lot of data centers are taking over kind of decommissioned or, abandoned facilities from the manufacturing era, right? It's kind of a great snapshot and a microcosm of what's happening. Traditional industries going by retiring or moving to other parts of the world, being replaced by digital infrastructure, data centers that house the servers that produce the digital content and applications workload that we all use and live with every day that you access through your phone. I've always thought of that, and the other one would be there in Canada and the US, newspaper printing presses now are data centers, right? Been converted. We don't really consume newspapers anymore, but where do we consume our news? On websites. Where are those websites? On your phone? Yes. But where are they accessed? Through servers that sit in data centers. And so you kind of see that old world transition to the new. So if you think of things in those terms, and these are inexorable, these things are in motion and there's nothing that's going to stop it, short of the world vaporizing. But if you think of it in those terms, you can see how these waves, or you can kind of, I think, come to see that these waves are significant. They are, going to happen over a long period of time. I don't think it's hyperbole when people say this, we had the Industrial Revolution, in the late in the 1800s. I don't necessarily think it's hyperbole to say that that's what we're undergoing, which is a complete, revolution. It's the digital infrastructure revolution, right? It's a transition from economies based on industry, on commodities, on physical things to digital, internet based. And if you believe that's going to continue, it becomes much more reasonable to think that what's happening around data centers and cloud and servers, compute infrastructure is on a similar path. And then think about, it's only been happening for 20 odd years. Imagine what, if it's not going to slow down, what could happen in the next 20, 25 years. So that's why I'm optimistic and why I'm still working in this space. I need employment.
Speaking of that, my last question is, there's young people out there that are looking at what am I going to do with my life, right? The unemployment, unemployment is so high for college graduates right now. Or there's even people in their, midlife career cycle that are thinking, what am I going to do? Is my job going to be replaced by AI? What should I do next? What should I be training for? What are the opportunities in the space, Phil? Do you see a few that you can talk about for people?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I speak with operating companies all the time, and a challenge they have is finding people with, industry or, subject matter knowledge, experience, expertise. It is not a common skill set to say, hey, I worked in cloud or data center or hyperscale, or I understand, how this industry works, or I've done it before. That's not something easily found at the executive level, at the mid-management level, so I think that there are, room for people who understand the space, who can analyze it, who can think about it critically and creatively to solve some of these problems. So we were ultimately, infrastructure is about solving problems. So whether you're coming out of school, whether you're mid-career, if you're good at solving problems or enjoy solving problems, looking at things from an analytical lens, and perhaps thinking a bit out of the box, there's tons of opportunity and upside in this space that's built on being able to solve problems that are not kind of easily visible. So that's what I would say is those kinds of minds. You can learn the space pretty quickly, right? It's, the building blocks and the ABCs of the space. Wouldn't be intimidated or scared if you're a young person listening coming out of school. No, explore it, take a look at it, and you can apply skills that you have built throughout your life, your education, your career to this point. All can translate. And like I said, if you're struggling, like you mentioned, Carrie, you're always looking for openings, shortages, kind of, where can my expertise or be, where is there scarcity? And I think this space, there is definitely, a level of scarcity that people may be able to exploit for their own gain.
You are right about that. How can we reach Structure Research, your website?
Yep. So we have a website and an event site for our summit. But if you go to our website, structureresearch.io, so just as it sounds, structureresearch.io, and there's a link to the event site there, but the event site URL, sorry that it's long, is infrastructuresummit.io. We like to use the .io. So yeah, that's structureresearch.io and infrastructuresummit.io. No fancy spellings or short, just the words.
And I think it's important that we all attend these events and these conferences because things are changing so rapidly. So I will for sure see you there in October.
Huh?
And Phil, thank you so much for coming on. This has been educational. I just really love learning from you. And I will, I'll learn more in October. I can't wait.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Take care.
Thanks for tuning in to Let's Get Digital. This podcast is powered by Broadstaff, a national staffing firm specializing in digital infrastructure talent. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and join me next time as we explore more stories at the intersection of technology, talent, and transformation. Until then, let's get digital.